Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Pauline Ravinet. I'm a political scientist at the University of Lille in France and a partner in the S4D4C project. I will have the pleasure to chair this S4D4C Spotlight session. And the spotlight today will be on the work implemented and the achievement of our project in terms of impact and alliances. So my S4D4C colleagues, Nadia Meyer from the German Aerospace Center and Laure-Anne Plumhans from the Center for Social Innovation in Vienna will be our panelists. So we have little time, so let us begin right now. Nadia, you were working on the impact dimension from the very beginning of the project. This was a strong point since the design of the project. Can you tell us where do we come from? What was the plan in terms of impact for the project?
Thank you, Pauline. Yes, I'm happy to do that. Of course, the overall aim of the Science for Diplomacy for Addressing Global Challenges project is to support current and future European science diplomacy in general. We see that on the slide as well. And of course, it was oriented very much to supporting European capacities, European foreign policy goals, and especially the development of solutions for global challenges. But certainly, as all other projects do, we had much more specific objectives that we tried to follow, and they were closely linked to all the activities we were doing. So we plan to provide some insight to science diplomacy, and of course those the research, the case studies, the conceptual framework, and these things that we produced. Also, we tried to increase capacities and knowledge within the project. So we had some trainings established. There will be some panels tomorrow about that. But it was very clear from the beginning, and it became very clear that in order to fulfill this overall goal and all the specific objectives as well, it would be very important to engage with multiple stakeholders within Europe, but also globally, in order to not only network, but to establish a lively community. This would be a key to realizing the objectives we had in mind.
Mm-hmm. So this impact and this objective of building a community on science diplomacy were very important from the start. Laure-Anne, now, could you give us a sense of the action that were implemented? What did we do in S4D4C?
Great, thank you, Pauline. So as Nadia explained, one of the biggest objectives that we had was to build a strong community. And to do this, we implemented a few instruments, and one of them was our networking meeting, like the one you are assisting now, which is a virtual meeting, but we also had two other physical meeting in Berlin and Madrid, which were used to really start building networks between stakeholders and science diplomacy enthusiasts. We also put a lot of energy in having a strong communication strategy to reach people that could be interested by the projects of science diplomacy. And we built mostly a very strong Twitter base, as you can see on this picture, where we have constantly increased our followers, and we are really happy to see that everyone is connecting, especially also during this event, thanks to our hashtag SciDip 2021. And we now have 3,152 followers from today's number, which is a growing number every day. We also use the LinkedIn or LinkedIn groups. One of them is together with our sister project SciDip, which we also collaborated a lot with, and we're very happy that we can always exchange with SciDip, and that brings us more, that connects the science diplomacy community even more, because we exchange on several topics and assist each other in different ways. Another way that we use our communication strategy is through our articles on our website, namely the Stakeholder Voices, where we try to give the voice to great institutions making use of science diplomacy and practicing science diplomacy. And those can be found on our website. And for example, we had a really great one with the Global Young Academy. We had one with the Central European Initiative, and many others. Also YASA, for example, which also is present in this panel, in several panels. Yeah, so that's really that was really the communication strategy that we approached. And we also tried to build our community further by, as I said before, trying to reach out to our sister projects. And we also received their help for one of our online course, where they participated into one case study in our online course, which was also a very key element for us to build our community, because through this online course, where we have more than 5,000 registration, we were able to also harness that community through several webinars, which were dedicated to interacting with this community. And that allowed us to really reach out to many different types of stakeholders, but also various numbers of science diplomacy enthusiasts, and also beyond the European continent. And I think that's something that can be addressed maybe further by my colleague Nadia and maybe Pauline. Yeah.
Yeah, just a little transition. Yeah, thank you so much, Laure-Anne. So really, indeed, a lot was done in terms of impact and building alliances. So some very important achievements were reached. So maybe Nadia, you want to specify in terms of geography and in terms of target groups?
Yes, I would like to do that. It was really very impressive for us to see how well the community grew. At the beginning, Laure-Anne already mentioned that we had 2 networking meetings, the first one in Madrid, the second one in Berlin, and already there we had international participation, means outside of Europe already, from India, New Zealand already at the first event. But one output of this Madrid event was the Madrid Declaration on Science Diplomacy, and this is a declaration that was signed by more than 167 individuals who endorse it, which come from all over the world, from all continents, which is a very great success as regards global outreach, I think. And during this networking meeting today, also we have participants who registered for the event, and I saw in different panels from all over the world, from India, South Africa, New Zealand, Norway, Brazil, Bangladesh, the Western Balkan countries. It's very impressive. But maybe the biggest leap or the biggest achievement was the European online course on science diplomacy, which is a free training program that is established within the project. And as Laure-Anne already mentioned, we had a large enrollment, more than 6,000 persons enrolled for that. And because it was not an interactive course, but it was static, we decided to have some webinars in addition to this online course. And the graph or the world map you see here shows the enrollment of people or individuals in these webinars. And it was very interesting that people from 97 countries from all over the world did participate in these webinars, and which is very nice for us, and which really is the basis for this argument that we had global outreach, is that from those 20 countries with the most common or the biggest number of participants, 11 were non-European countries like Argentina, Mexico, Ecuador, Brazil, Colombia, the USA, which is really, really nice. Yeah. Also, it has to be said that we had a kind of a really regional regional impact, I think. And one good example is the Latin American community. Participation from Latin American people is really intense. This is what we see. And this might not only be caused, but also due to some of our partners in the project are very active in this region. For example, we had a colleague of ours published a UNESCO policy paper on science diplomacy in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this paper will be uptaken in the Latin American regional discussion on science diplomacy for the Latin American Open Science Forum, which will be held in April this year. So I think this shows that the work that was done in our project reached very far and far beyond the European borders, if you want to call them that. But we did not only have a global impact or global outreach and build a strong community, but we also reached different target groups. And I think Laure-Anne can tell us a little more about that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Nadia. So as Nadia mentioned, we had a great global outreach, but we also wanted from the beginning to really harness the various actors of the science diplomacy community and really share the message around the world into different groups, because those are necessary for a lively science diplomacy practice. For example, here you see on the slide here is the representation per backgrounds of our students that enrolled in our online course. And you can really see here that we managed to reach people from social sciences, natural sciences, or medical or health sciences, which shows the diversity of the science diplomacy community and of the people that are interested in science diplomacy. Moreover, we also noticed a very, very high interest from the scientific community, as I said, from different fields, but which is extremely important for science diplomacy to work. We noticed a bit less involvement from the diplomat side, or the diplomacy foreign affairs side, which is also due to the fact that there are also less diplomats compared to scientists in terms of number, of absolute relative numbers. As I said, we wanted to reach not only different professions, but we also wanted to be inclusive and make sure that our content and the people that we reach achieves gender balance. So we were aware that gender balance and gender equality issues are very important from the start, and then science diplomacy can only work if everyone in society is involved. But we were very glad to see that we got a very high interest rate from women. So we have a very gender balanced audience, and we also try to have a gender balanced content and consortiums, because our consortium is very female dominated, as sometimes it can be obvious in certain meetings. But we also have a lot of our followers, or Twitter's followers, or also the students of our online course are mostly women, or not mostly, but a bit more. We have a bit more women than men taking part in our online course. It's also something that we've noticed during our webinars. And that's something we are really proud about. So we can say that we achieved a global outreach and an inclusive outreach. And beyond that, and I will then give the floor to my colleague Pauline, because she has personal experience with this. One of the aim of the science diplomacy of the S4D4C projects was to also support other organizations that wanted to implement their own approach to science diplomacy, and this was done several times. And maybe Pauline, if you would like to take back the floor and tell us a bit more about your personal experience regarding alliances and the support that we gave to them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Laure-Anne. I think this is a very important point, because openness has always been extremely important for S4D4C partner, and this notion that developing an EU project on science diplomacy, it's not about building a private club. On the contrary, It's about being open. It's about connecting with other organizations. It's about spreading the word, and it's about sharing our findings and our tools and our creative ideas about science diplomacy with other organizations. So S4D4C partner, and sometimes together with people from our sisters project, we were involved in other organizations' own projects on science diplomacy. And this is very important, and this is part of building a community. So S4D4C was, for instance, involved in PRIMA workshops to explore the role of science diplomacy in the Mediterranean. And another experience which I was personally involved in is with the AUF. AUF is the acronym for Agence Universitaire de la Francophonie. So maybe if you attended the session on universities this morning, you heard about this. And so together, me and together with our colleague Pierre-Bruno Ruffini from the Inside project, we were involved in the setup of a task force in this global network of universities. So a task force dedicated to developing the own AUF approach for science diplomacy, so diplomatie scientifique francophone for francophone universities all over the world, north and south. And this is a project led at the Direction Europe de l'Ouest of the organization. So we were involved in an advisory committee trying to fuel the discussion with finding from our research project, and also disseminating our tools and supporting and giving advice. And this was extremely exciting to see this science diplomacy approach being developed in the organization by the actors there. So this was for an example on AUF. So I don't see if we have any questions regarding previous points and achievements within the chat or within the Q&A section.
I think there was no question in the chat.
So far, we don't.
That's also fine.
Okay.
I think.
Could I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Go
ahead.
It's a question and a comment. I'm interested in that AUF. I had not heard about it. Have you been in touch with an organization called SciDip? CIDMEF?
I don't think so. Then my
suggestion is maybe then, if there is still any future on this, because you're talking about achievements already, and I don't know how much that has come to an end already. But SciDip is the organization that links all the, also on the scientific side, all the medical schools in the Francophone countries in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
there are 58 or so, and they have their own organization of the deans of the medical schools, and they exchange and work together on basically globalizing their scientific achievements and work. And it's, I think, quite important also in terms of the quality of the science. They do accreditation of different medical schools in Africa, in Asia, in Quebec, in, well, all the Francophone countries in the world.
Well, thank you very much for highlighting this. Actually, this is something that is very interesting about Francophonie, that this is a constellation of organization connected Francophone actors all over the world, whether in science or in diplomacy or in science diplomacy or in international organization. So there is a great potential for science diplomacy in this constellation of organizations. Maybe we want to jump to our last point.
I think that concludes it. Actually, I think we covered everything what we discussed previously, and I'm very happy that we could showcase to you the achievements that we tried to achieve with the S4D4C project and how we did it. And we are really happy to receive any feedback and any constructive thoughts on how to go forward with science diplomacy in general. And I think it's time to hand the floor to Mitchell, if I'm not mistaken, in about 30 seconds.
Yeah, and this is very important because this has been a very special year for all the world around us, and for science diplomacy, and for our project too. The fact that we had the eruption of COVID-19 in the picture, and so this was something that was, of course, a source of innovation and creativity and necessary adjustment within the project. But this was very inspiring, and this was a very, very strong question for science diplomacy as such as well. And this is going to be the main topic of the next session. And this is a major topic: science diplomacy and COVID-19.
So thanks very much for the panel, and for turning now this over to the roundtable section of this session. And what we're focusing on in the roundtable is building alliances to tackle COVID-19, and COVID-19 obviously being something that has come up again and again throughout the conference here already. And this is our chance to really tackle it head on, because it's always been kind of, how does the other stuff relate to it? And we want to really get into the heart of the matter here. We have 4 distinguished panelists with us, or on their way to be with us. We have Roger Pielke Jr., Annelies Wilder-Smith, Miguel Nicoleas, and Oak Pannenburg. And I'll introduce you to them a little bit more just before their first interventions. They all come with extensive CVs, with excellent scientific backgrounds, and also each of them is involved in at least one, sometimes more than one, alliance related to COVID-19. So you can find a lot more details on them in the website, and I'll just briefly introduce myself. So I'm Mitchell Young. I am for S4D4C. I'm doing the case studies work package, and I'm also an assistant professor at Charles University in the Institute for International Studies. So in this roundtable, what we want to explore is what the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us and is still teaching us, of course, about science diplomacy, and particularly about the alliances and interactions between multiple stakeholders, as well as these emerging spaces in which new forms of science diplomacy are taking place. So we, as the S4D4C project, have produced a policy brief on COVID-19 in which we focused on how it can help building better science diplomacy, and we have analysis there. We have several policy recommendations. There's also a related infographic, which you'll find in our training materials. But what we'll try to do in the roundtable now is keep things fairly informal, to have a discussion with several rounds of questions. We also have a poll for you in the audience, and we will begin with a question just to let the panelists talk about some of the alliances that they're on. The second round of questions will get a little bit more critical in terms of what isn't going right with the alliances and with the efforts on dealing with the pandemic. And then we're going to try to leave plenty of time for you to share for the panelists to answer your questions. So please do make good use of the question and answer session. You can vote on questions, you can vote them up. So please take advantage of that. So let me just jump right in and let me introduce our first panelist, Roger Pielke Jr. And he's a professor in environmental studies in the University of Colorado, where he works on policy and governance issues related to science, technology, environment, innovation, and sports. Many of you might know him from his book. You might have read The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science in Policy and Politics. Roger is currently focusing on the ESCAPE project. This is an NSF-sponsored 16-country evaluation of science advice in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I want to begin, Roger, just by asking you to talk a little bit about what you found so far. I know you've just started recently, but I also know you've got some stuff up there. And what you found so far, what sort of policy coordination and translation are you finding, particularly like, who's behind these efforts, and is there sort of a cross-border diplomatic dimension to what's going on?
Thanks, Mitchell. It's great to be here. Hello, everybody from Boulder, Colorado. Yeah, the ESCAPE project, we are just starting to get our initial case study draft reports. So we're early in it, but there are some emerging themes that are coming out. And one of them, and despite being in the title of my project, is that the notion of science advice may have outlived its moment. We want science advice, of course, but what policymakers around the world in COVID really want is integrated advice. And one of the fault lines that we've seen in many of the case studies is that we are very well organized in many places around the world for public health expert advice. But what policymakers have wanted in many contexts is the integration of economic advice and public health advice. And it turns out that integration function in our expert advisory bodies doesn't always work. And part of that is due to the fact that when you say science advice, people in their minds have a fairly limited perspective as to what science actually is. And usually economics doesn't get placed in there. Another issue we're finding is complexity. For a long time, and I give a lot of credit to INGSA, the International Network for Government Science Advice. For a long time, the community has tried to prepare governments and experts for providing advice. But it turns out if there's an erupting volcano, you need one sort of type of advice. But if there's a pandemic that's ongoing for a year or more, you need structures in place that will last for a long time and can evolve as the pandemic evolves. I'll just give you a simple example. Most expert advisors are volunteers in most countries we're looking at. If you're going to ask them to spend hours and hours over a year or more to work on science advice topics, we have to figure out how to support them. We have to, there's issues involving, their family situation, health, and so on. Then the last thing I'll say is that there are some real important questions that are being raised about the WHO, which is an essential and important organization, but both at the outset of the pandemic and now in the efforts to try to determine, what can we learn about where it originated and where it's going. There's a lot of diplomatic and coordination activities going on in the science advisory world, and I think we're just at the start of that.
Excellent, thank you. You raise a lot of really interesting questions. I want to come back to a whole bunch of them. I think especially this issue you bring up about integrated knowledge, and one of the things that we think about, I think, or we need to think about more is, how as well the social sciences, the humanities even fit into this picture, if they do fit into the picture. I mean, it feels to me a little bit like, we were told by historians about the Spanish flu of 1918, and we're reliving it. Why don't we believe them? Why don't we take them seriously? So I think we'll come back to it. I want to, if you want to jump in with a quick response, you may. If not, I'm going to move to Oak for a second. But
yeah, I mean, I think you raise a very important point. And one of our case studies, Italy in particular, has a standing committee on bioethics that pre-existed the pandemic. But it turns out that they were not particularly influential in the current response, and much of the attention was focused on public health. So you do raise this issue that in our world, the academic world, we divide by disciplines, but in the real world, problems come fully integrated, and we need to span that gap.
Great, thanks. Let me turn to Oak Pannenberg. He has been active in global health for over 50 years. He served as the former World Bank Chief Health Advisor. He's also been Director and Chief Health Scientist in the Netherlands. He's lived in many countries in Africa and Asia. He also was chair of the World Bank's Pandemic Committee between 2003 and 2009 and was closely involved in the global Ebola response. Today, he's a member of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission on Global Health Governance and of the US National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Pandemic Committee. So, Oke, I'd like to start just by asking you about these two committees that you're on. You know, are they similar? Are they different? How effective have they been in getting, you know, relations and getting knowledge to policymakers, both on a national and on international level?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you and to share hopefully some thoughts that may give rise to ultimately a better future in this field. And that's actually under the, let's say, the formal statements, the ultimate objective of all these committees and commissions that are ongoing. It's clear from the current pandemic that the world was insufficiently prepared. And so now all these efforts are underway to ensure that not if, because it's pretty clear, it's not an if, it's a when in the future another pandemic would come along that potentially might be much more devastating than the current one, how to respond to that in a way that doesn't go like the current one. And obviously science plays a big role in that. Your outline of our hour of discussion said maybe share which you see as the organizations or alliances that play a big role in currently addressing the pandemic. And then your second question was, what's not going right or what's going right? And then ultimately concluding what could be done best for the future. I have difficulty distinguishing your first point with your second point. So let me start with the first point, because I have only 3 minutes, I see. So the first point is that the organizations and science plays a role in all of them that are involved in this. You need to look at what's called the international health regulations. That's managed by WHO and has existed since the 1950s and is explicitly intended to manage pandemics or major health threats to the world. Then secondly, you have a long-standing system of what's called the Influenza Network. So influenza, as we know, is a pandemic since, as Roger already mentioned, and you also, since 100 years ago. It's called the Spanish flu colloquially. One should realize that the Spanish flu had nothing to do with Spain. It was only reported at the time in Spain. It's actually a US. It originated in Haskell County in Kansas. So the 1918-1920 pandemic originated in the United States. And then the organizations that are involved in this are Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccine and Immunizations, the Global Fund for Malaria and AIDS and TB, WHO, of course, UNICEF, CEPI, which is an organization specifically of scientists for the future of vaccines and diagnostics and therapeutics for infectious diseases. And then, of course, we have COVAX, which is the organization that would ensure that the vaccines against COVID-19 would be available around the world, together with an organization that was specifically created, the ACT Accelerator, which is important because it includes also non-governmental industry, universities, scientific institutions, etc. And then, of course, increasingly important these days is the WTO, which has a new head, Ngozi, who previously was with the World Bank, and they need to play a role that all the knowledge is available through trade. And since the WTO oversees patent and licensing, they play a main role in the sharing of knowledge that comes out of science. Then, to be honest, one should realize that all these organizations, and this is my second point, it's difficult to distinguish from the first point, all of those, like Roger already kind of indicated, it's not working. Let's be, we can be very diplomatic about it, but there's no use to be very diplomatic about it. It's very clear that all these networks that were created, there was even a so-called Brundtland Commission, the former Prime Minister of Norway, for a so-called pandemic preparation board, etc. And with due respect, almost all of them failed to address this in a way of preparing for the right knowledge through science and research, and then secondly, combining them in a diplomatic effort or a joint effort to reduce it. And so this whole fragmentation that we have now around the world, not only with regard to managing the pandemic, but also responding to it with diagnostics and therapeutics and prevention with vaccines, is really, really worrisome. And I can say a little bit later, more about that a little bit later, but let me stop there to set the scene at least.
Great, thank you. You know, I think that this overlaps as well with what we were hearing from Roger about the complexity, and clearly there's this complex network of organizations. You've mentioned quite a few of them. And I sort of wonder, maybe just to follow up briefly with you, is what's not working the fact that these are, there is no sort of overarching guidance? And how would we possibly deal with that? How do we deal with this complex system in which no one's really in charge? We've set up a lot of organizations. Is it that we need different organizations? Is it we need a new way to sort of govern the organizations that are in existence? Yeah, how do you see that?
Yeah, so that actually goes already to your third element. How can we do it better? And fortunately, there are several, and we can go into some of the details a little bit later. Very interestingly, yesterday, a major report came out from the European Office of WHO, committed, chaired by Mario Monti, talking about what can the world, Europe, it was instigated by Europe, but what can we do to do this better? And it's very clear that now the inclination is to, is similar like with the Montreal Protocol for the CFCs. Remember the ozone stuff, where it was built on science, on scientific knowledge and insight, similar to the IPCC for the climate change. You can't manage pandemics just by regulation or one organization like WHO saying all member states, all governments need to do this or this. You need a treaty. You need a treaty with strong obligations, almost in the same way as you have with trying to prevent nuclear war. So, because it's at the same level. Look, we have only, let's say, a few million only, with my apologies to those who would take that as in offense, only 2 million people who died from the current pandemic. If the rate of reproduction of the COVID-19 virus would be similar to measles, and what we call the case fatality rate, the people who die from the infection, would be similar to Ebola or Lassa fever or Nipah virus, you would not see 2 million people die. You would see 150 million or 400 million people die. See, so this is similar to nuclear war, or there are very few events that can impact human society and the world economy to this extent. So you cannot leave it to some regulation by one UN agency or another one. You need an overall global treaty like climate change, like nuclear war treaties to prevent any future pandemic that would be much, much more damaging than the current one.
So let me come back to Roger on that, and in two ways. You brought us up the World Health Organization and some concerns, and I'd like you to maybe, if you want to share some of those concerns that you have and some of the challenges. I think I can imagine from what you said before, but maybe we'll get them out on the table. but also there's this idea, that maybe the environmental sort of treaties are a model for where we go forward. And I wonder, your expertise is obviously in environmental affairs. One of the things that goes in my mind all the time is whether COVID is something that gives us hope or really gives us a fear that we can never solve some problems like the environmental problems that require sort of extreme behavioral changes. So I'm curious, how do you see this parallel? Is there a good parallel there? Is it a positive parallel, or is this something that doesn't sort of bode well for the future?
Yeah, this is a great question, and let me just say I want to reinforce and endorse the comments that Oak made. I agree entirely. I think it's absolutely essential that the world starts discussing a pandemic treaty. This issue is every bit as serious as climate change, nuclear war, and as such should be discussed at that level. One thing to understand about the environmental agreements and the role of science in them, whether it's the IPCC or its equivalent in biodiversity, IPBES, these organizations are designed to be on the back burner and cook slowly, and they produce their results over many years. And one of the things we've learned in the pandemic, that it's much more like an approaching hurricane than it is long-term issues like biodiversity or climate change. So one of the key issues that we've seen is the central role that the IHR and underneath it, the WHO play in declaring a public health emergency of international concern. That's a trigger that leads to action in different countries around the world. It's a single trigger. And figuring out if there can be some sort of coordination and better processes for declaring that emergency, because it is somewhat opaque. It's not clear what role politics plays in it. And so getting countries to agree on the processes, the criteria for that to occur that would then trigger national action. One other thing, because there is no centralized, authoritative, legitimate provision of scientific guidance on this issue, we've seen around the world, in many countries, the rise of what I'm calling shadow science advice, whether they're organized, whether they're legitimate, but it's contrary opinions. And some of it's very legitimate, but what it does is it allows politicians to pick and choose. I like this science, I like that science. And we get a very disparate tapestry of responses, whether it's opening schools or lockdowns, whatever it happens to be. And it makes it very difficult, I think, for politicians to maintain legitimacy grounded in evidence and science.
Yeah, let me bring up one example, and you tell me how you react to it, because I think that this is something that came up when we talk about science. We talk about one thing is expertise and another thing is evidence, and science should be based on the second, right, on evidence. And yet when we started with the COVID pandemic, we didn't have any evidence. We didn't know anything about this, and so we relied on expertise. And one of the things that happened is it took a very long time and really a lot of effort to convince the World Health Organization and others that this virus spreads through aerosols. And so how do we get to that point? In other words, if we were just sticking with agreed upon science, would we get there? How do we get this sort of updated science into these organizations more effectively? How do we deal with that dynamic?
Yeah, in general, I mean, my experience and my sense is we do a pretty good job of assembling, or we can do a pretty good job of assembling and sorting through evidence, even when it's uncertain, even when we have areas of ignorance. It turns out in a fast emerging issue like COVID, we don't know everything at the beginning, and things that we think we know later we'll learn we think were false, like aerosol spread. This is why it's so important to understand that what policymakers need, whether they want it or not, it's a different question, but what they need is policy guidance. And the best policy guidance that can be provided are options that are robust to uncertainties. So from my perspective, very on a lot of the debate focused on the R0 number, it focused on flattening the curve, but you didn't see very much put out there in terms of, all right, here's a suite of options robust to uncertainty that we can take a look at and then evaluate and see what works. So again, more coordination, more sharing of experiences and information, and recognizing experts will disagree, and that's perfectly legitimate. But having some centralized way, some centralized processes to air that is essential to good decision making.
Oh, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah. Let me. I fully agree with what Roger said, but let me also highlight it from a slightly different angle. It's unfortunate, and if you look carefully into the history of organizations like WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank, IMF, the Global Fund, and all these organizations that are involved in this. As we know, science and research are in the same universe. Now, if you look carefully, an organization like WHO, which is kind of the bigger animal in this whole sequence that I mentioned, but even the World Bank, the word research is not in there. So WHO has a very checkered history in terms of even the policy notion. Should WHO be involved in research or not? And there's a reason why, for example, the biggest research program with WHO is the Tropical Disease Research and Training Program. But it's not the WHO program. It's a joint program of WHO, UNICEF, UNDP, and the bank. See? So it's kind of special program, a little bit outside, because we don't want to do this within the organization. And then there was a committee on whether they should do health research or medical research. Well, the agreement is medical research is none of WHO's business. So then you already have right there a problem. But what do you do with virology? That's obviously both a basic science issue and a clinical issue. See, so there needs to be a recalibration within the recognition, even within the bank, where research is only perceived as economic research, right? And not research either of the hard sciences or the behavioral sciences. When behavioral economics comes along and we have people like Vogel or Canaro who are inclined, or Schelling, who are inclined towards behavioral economics and get the Nobel Prize for that, then the bank will say, okay, we'll include a little bit of that. But the problem is that, exactly as Roger says, if you want to have solid policy decisions that have a global impact, you need to anchor it in new knowledge, in existing knowledge, and therefore the research and the science need to be recognized as valid within your own universe. And that's a challenge which is still very much up there and is partly responsible, in my view, to this kind of hee-hawing in the beginning as to, okay, what do we do here? Who do we invite? That fragmentation that Roger referred to, which scientists, etc. See, so there's an area. Later I can say a little bit more about the networks that can play a role in this, in terms of the scientific diplomacy that plays a role. But that's an important issue to realize, that research and science is not necessarily strongly anchored in any of these international, essentially policy organizations. They're not research organizations. They're not science organizations. See? So we need to, in the world of global diplomacy towards future pandemics, you need to build in that science and the underlying research and technology of it becomes an integral part of the structure and not an afterthought.
An excellent point, thank you. I want to come back to both of you to talk more about the challenges, but before we do that, let me just put up a poll for the audience, those of you who are sitting there quietly in the background, and ask you, what do you think, the main challenges for science diplomacy in the COVID-19 crisis? And we've put up 9 different options there. Please go ahead and choose up to 3 of them that you find are the main challenges. And we're gonna leave this up for about a minute, and then we're going to come back to it a little bit later after I give the floor back to our panelists. But take a few seconds here, give us your first reactions, in terms of what you think about that. This is a question that we had actually asked in almost the same format, but not quite, in a survey that we conducted in January and February. It was our final survey. We put a few questions about COVID into that. And if we have a bit of time later, I'll come back and talk about those. But it looks like we probably have just the two of you, Roger, Oak, as participants. We're having some technical problems getting one person in, and so we have a little bit more time. And I noticed that there's already quite a few questions in the question and answer, so we'll come to them in a few minutes as well. But it looks like we're getting the votes in. We have, well, only about a third of the people voting, so we'll leave. Okay, I guess like we've closed the poll, so we'll come back to it, and we can talk about the results in a few minutes. But let me come back to the two of you. Maybe if I continue with you, Oak, if you would talk a little bit about what you see as the biggest challenges, or you've already spoken to a number of them, but are there any that you haven't sort of been able to bring out at this point?
Yeah, my sense is that, let me mention two items that I think would need additional attention. One is, and I'm staying, for the first one, I'm staying a little bit on the science side, since I noticed that in previous sessions in your wonderful weekly program, this came up a little bit. Balancing, and this is specifically for the pandemic universe, if you like, balancing the hard sciences with the behavioral sciences. What I would call, there is a so-called demand deficit in the scientific approach to the current pandemic. So what we see is an overarching presentation of scientific advice from virology, from microbiology, from the epidemiology, and so on, all mathematical modeling, you name it. Essentially, the hard sciences, including the various clinical sciences, infectious disease, everybody and his mother is an armchair specialist in this field now, right? Now, at the same time, when the pandemic evolves, we see these reactions among the people. So you see, even my little country, or my original little country, the Netherlands, you had several days of major population protests against rules and regulations of lockdowns, closing economic activity, and so on and so forth. So where are, let's say, when we have on the rostrum Dr. Fauci, where is Dr. Sociologist? Where is Dr. Anthropologist? Where are these sciences, the pandemic sociology, the pandemic understanding how humans as a group or as individuals or households, how they would react? I would argue that, unfortunately, the rich world, whether it's the US or Europe or Japan, South Korea, or the Australias, etc., can learn from the programs in this respect in Africa and in Asia. You have a large program on a parasitic disease called river blindness, onchocerciasis in Africa. And while you can top down do all kind of programming and funding to control that disease, which is really a major effect on economies of African countries, to control it, those programs, which have existed for 25 years, have created a demand function in communities. So you have villages who own the problem. It's not the government who tells you, you have to do this or this or this. It's the communities themselves. They say, we have this river blindness program. We are going to do something about it. See? So the balance between from the bottom up and owning the problem, in this case, COVID-19 and the infection, and the government with its hard sciences coming from the top, that balance is not equal at the moment. So that's one element. The second element that I wanted to mention is, which I'm missing in much of the discussions, logical in research and science, but still it has to be there, is financing. You need not only to finance the response to the pandemic, but you need also to finance the science and the research underlying any effective response. So if you look at, fortunately, mind you, the vaccinology sciences have performed unusually well, of course. It was inconceivable a year ago that we would have 7 or 8 different vaccines that are turning out to be effective. That is a major achievement of science. There's no doubt about it. And under the surface, many of the scientists who were working on these vaccines interacted with each other. And that wonderful agreement between J&J and Merck to work together on producing now the vaccines is a very good example. But what is behind it, you need the money. And the money in terms of, unfortunately, the World Bank had a so-called pandemic bond system. It failed miserably in the same line as Roger indicated in the early days. See, so it didn't work. So, and you cannot finance the future answer to a pandemic with, let's say, $80 million or $160 million here or there. No, look, the damage to the global economy runs around $20 trillion at the moment, 1/5 of total global GDP, or almost more than 1/5. So you need a response, if necessary, in the trillions of dollars at the global level. So that whole question of how to bring in the international financial institutions, the commercial finance, and the financing of the science and research necessary preceding it is, I think, an area that needs much, much more attention.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think this ties very much in with when we talk about green financing as well. What I want to do, first of all, I'm very happy to see that we've worked out some of the technical things, and we have Annelies Wilder-Smith here with us. I'm going to just keep with the sequence that we have and let Roger speak, and then we're going to come to you and talk, Annelies, about vaccines. Obviously, you're the expert on vaccines. You're in the middle of the world on that, and this is what, of course, we're all talking about and thinking about these days. So, Roger, if you wanted to respond on the challenges, and then we'll move on to Annelies.
Yeah, great. And I'll just quickly say, I mean, I again agree with Oak, and I'll add 3 probably overlapping issues. One is I agree that there was a failure of preparation in varying degrees in varying places. One of the things that's emerged from my research looking at the US case is that in the aftermath of the H1N1 virus and pandemic, which of course wasn't the same scale as coronavirus, in 2009 and 2010, a country like Japan passed a law that set in place mechanisms for securing expert advice in the next pandemic. In the United States, this didn't happen. And the United States, with its enormous wealth, its large ecosystem of science and expertise, was shockingly unprepared on the advisory side for a pandemic. Part of this, of course, is due to what I would say is the incompetence of the Trump administration, but it's not entirely. There's a long history there of a lack of preparation. The second challenge, I think, is we've seen among expert advisors, we often talk about how important it is for policymakers to understand science. Yes, granted, but it's really important for experts to understand politics as well. And there's a lot of cases around the world, on the one side, of official government advisors engaging in what we might call stealth advocacy. They're using their role as experts to try to promote a particular policy end. On the flip side of that, we see experts who are outside of official government mechanisms of advice, engaging in shadow science advice. In the United States, this resulted in a Stanford professor, Scott Atlas, going from being a speaking head on Fox News in the United States right to the White House, and which delegitimizes science. So we experts need to figure out some standards for what is ethical behavior. The last thing I'll say is that coordination and multi-level governance is absolutely essential. You have the WHO, you have the nations here, we have the US states. I'm in a county, I'm in a city, I have a university. They all have science advice, and they have to coordinate. There's 3 areas where I think expertise is really important. One is in what we may call science or policy advice. The second is in data. And the third is in regulations, such as vaccine approval. And it's very much my opinion that expertise work the best, and I agree with Oak, in the development of the vaccines. And partly that's because it has a technological end, and it works or it doesn't. And so we can all agree on what success is. There were a lot of failures with data, and we should be good on data. Data is collecting numbers, even if they're uncertain, even if they change over time, but a lot of failures on data. And then on the advisory side, there's a lot of work we can do. So I do think there's some challenges, but the good news is that I think we can identify them and improve them going forward.
Great, thank you. So let me introduce to everyone Annelies Wilder-Smith. She's a professor of emerging infectious diseases at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a visiting professor at the Lee Kong Chian School of Medicine in Singapore. Annelies specializes in emerging viral diseases, including Zika, SARS, and now COVID. She serves as consultant to the Initiative of Vaccine Research at the World Health Organization and is currently the focal point at the WHO for the SAGE Working Group on Policy Recommendations with regard to COVID-19 vaccines. So welcome, Annelies. Tell us a bit about your role as this focal point at the WHO. What's going on? What are you doing? Who are you working with?
All right. So currently, I'm the focal point for the SAGE working group on COVID-19 vaccines, and so our role is to issue policy recommendations on how best to use a vaccine at a time of limited supply. So we talk about prioritization within countries, but also allocation between countries for equitable distribution. I think, despite of all the criticisms against COVAX, I think we need to highlight the achievement. COVAX is a facility to try to end the pandemic by the end of this year by delivering 2 billion doses. And the achievement is, on the 31st of December, the first emergency use listing for the first vaccine was given. By 24 February, the first COVAX vaccines were delivered. So this is an unprecedented short time frame. Now, in the pandemic, every day counts, and to me, even that time frame was too long. But if you look in hindsight, these 6 weeks, that was an incredible achievement, and they have, and the intent is to deliver by end of April vaccines to all countries that have signed up to the COVAX. And indeed, as I said, to have 2 billion doses by the end of the year. So the current problem is not lack of political will or resources or time. The current problem for COVAX is vaccine supply. But I want, if you give me, Mitchell, a few minutes, I want to talk about vaccine diplomacy. And just remind you about polio in the past. Polio was actually addressed at a time of Cold War between the US and Russia. And it were the scientists from Russia and the US who, behind or almost hidden, would meet and discuss how best to develop a polio vaccine and then to roll it out. And they were successful. We are also vaccine diplomacy can be shown, even in times of wars in Afghanistan or whatever, Nigeria, where a whole country would say, okay, today we stop fighting so we can give polio vaccines, or we do an immunization program. And so vaccines can be used as a diplomatic tool. For example, Venezuela, sold, or the other way around, I think with Cuba, you sell vaccines, you get oil back. And now China obviously wanted to position itself as with a new soft power through vaccines, and whether they have managed, I'm not so sure, but you will see that China is really focusing on delivering vaccines to Africa and to Southeast Asia in the moment. So much so that US said, oh, we have to be careful and counter the China's influence through vaccination in Southeast Asia. And now the US is also trying to provide more vaccines into this part. The other concern about vaccine diplomacy is also vaccine wars. We've seen, with the vaccine supply issues, Europe has vaccine supply issues. The US is keeping the vaccine supply of nanoparticles stopping it to get to Europe, not actively stopping it, but trying to use it for themselves. Or the issues between, for AstraZeneca with the UK, where they had better access than Europe, which almost had an international diplomatic uproar with regards to Ireland. So I think it's beautiful to see how now vaccines take such a center stage in the world at this time. And so it could go right, but it can also go wrong.
Thanks so much. I'm going to stay with you for a couple minutes because you haven't had as much chance to sort of express things. When you talk about the problem is supply, of course, this puts vaccines in very good company with all kinds of political issues. Most of the political issues we have are issues of supply, of limited resources and how we distribute them. And so I ask you, within your group, I mean, who's making these decisions and what kind of resources and knowledge are you using to do that? I mean, do you include the humanities, the social science, ethicists? Who gets involved in this decision of how you are distributing the vaccines? Who gets them? How does that work?
Incredibly complex. And obviously, so these roles cannot be done by one single agency. Right? For example, so procurement and vaccine supply and just shipment is done by UNICEF together with Gavi. That's not WHO's role. WHO's role is to give normative guidance, standards, assessments, policy recommendations, how best to use it. WHO is not a policing. They can't enforce their guidance, and it's up to countries to take them on or not. So no, if you ask me, no, we're all sharing this incredibly complex task to address a vaccine supply. I mean, just during the initial lockdown in China, as you know, we just could not, in Europe, and I live in Switzerland, a really wealthy country, we could not get masks, and it was a supply chain problem because China was locked down. We could not get the things. Initially with the testing, I remember when our assays ran out, and it was because Italy was in a lockdown and we just couldn't get a certain ingredient for the assays to Switzerland. So all these little things during a lockdown were affected. But now currently, I think we now need to learn how to be less dependent on globalization. But our current main concern is unfortunately, vaccine nationalism is very strong. It was unfortunately driven by the previous US administration. They're now trying to rectify it. It is looking better. US is back with WHO. US back is giving money to COVAX. US is involved with a lot of policy making now. So I think we are on the bend. But if you look at the numbers, the US has bought all the vaccines, and Europe literally, we have a problem. And there is even between two high income countries, we have now an inequity problem, not only with the lower income countries. In fact, when in March last year, we in Switzerland had no masks, no hand sanitizers. At the same time, millions of masks were sent to Africa. And I looked at pictures in Africa and India, and everyone was wearing masks. And we could not even buy it in rich, wealthy Switzerland. So this is the modern development of things. Over to you.
You raise a tremendous number of really fascinating issues. And I think this comes back to something that Roger had said right at the beginning of this idea of integrated advice, and supply chains certainly being a key issue in all of this. I think as well, we could throw intellectual property into this issue. We've seen that with open science has been one of the great success stories of the pandemic, I think. One of the few. We see that basically the agreement that was pre-established went into effect right away. Other organizations that were not part of it right away joined in. And pretty much all of the knowledge that's out there. And right now, I was just looking, there's over 170,000 articles on COVID that are listed in the WHO database. So that's all out there and open. And yet when we come to things like vaccines or the technologies, there's not the same degree of openness and sharing of intellectual property as we see. And that's maybe to be expected, but at the same time, I think this is an issue we saw it come up. Some countries brought up the idea that why don't we have a moratorium on intellectual property rights on vaccines for the time being, which was very quickly shot down. So maybe this is one question, and I'll sort of open it up, and I want to get to everyone back there now. And the other thing that you raised is China, and of course Russia as well, but particularly China, and this very complicated relationship that we have with China in dealing with not only with COVID, but with all kinds of other global challenges and other kinds of issues. And it's been coming up throughout the conference. And so let me just open up the floor if any of you want to speak to either of those issues.
I'll be happy to jump in.
Go ahead, Roger, and then I saw Oak as well.
Yeah, I think, Annalise's comments are they're fascinating, and they reveal, and I think we should all understand that these issues, they have a really important scientific and technological dimension to them, but ultimately they're political. They're political from the start all the way through the finish. And I one point I want to make is that expert advice in democratic or non-democratic systems is every bit as complex as developing a vaccine or virology or whatever the technical issue is. And I see, there's her comments to me raise three issues. There's the management of expertise, there's the integration of different expertise, and there's the implementation of expertise. For example, a vaccine is just a technological product, but then you have to implement it. You have to share it around the world. It has to get into arms. And then I guess the last point I would make in response is that the success in developing vaccines, for all of the vaccine nationalism and troubles, it should give us a lesson that for some really complicated issues, the best route out of the challenge is through technology, not through science. Can people just imagine if the only tools we had were lockdowns, social distancing, masks, and so on, we probably would never get out of COVID. And so we have to be aware that there are some solutions. The idea of a technological fix is sometimes offensive, but there's sometimes where we should be really glad that there's such a thing as a vaccine, and that by the end of the year, the world might be moving past this. Thank goodness for producing technology.
Thanks. Oak, please.
Yeah. In many respects, what Annalise shared with us, of course, resonates with all of us. At the same time, it's not a desirable situation. It's very complicated. I think the decision-making process in Brussels shows the challenges for the future for countries working together on policy when the scientific and the research background for many years leading up to that was insufficient. And that brings me, you can of course talk now how to do that better in the next 12 months or the next 2 years. But I think in the context of this conference, I would like to emphasize and recommend that all of those who have not seen it, maybe some of you have seen it, 4 weeks ago, UNCTAD published its 2021 report on science and technology. And that is a major piece of work. I'm not generally a big supporter of UNCTAD, but this report they identify 11 technologies, let's say gene editing, robotics, nanotechnology, AI, the Internet of Things, 5G, drones, 3D printing, big data, solar, voltaics, and blockchain. So very specific, those 11 technologies. And they analyze how the 190 to 200 countries of the world deal with this. And they extend it to the year 2050. And it's very interesting. They take into account, of course, the SDG framework, etc., and the research and science that are linked to all these 11 technologies. And they conclude that unless there is major intervention, that by the year 2050, you have 2 major power structures in the world, including the economies that follow these technologies, and that's China and the US. Europe will be kind of in the middle, depending on how they react to this. But at this moment, they're the weakest of the three rich countries. Then the middle income countries that have some capacity in the field of technology and research may go up a little bit in that world. But the surprising conclusion is that there is a large group of countries, around 50, that will actually, because of the progress of these technologies and economies dependent on these 11 technologies, that those 50 countries will go back in terms of development and become a whole group of very poor countries vis-a-vis the very rich countries of the US, China, and their satellites. See, now I think that is a major issue because it brings in the issue of equity. And of course, Annelies already referred to the importance of ensuring that that the vaccines, for example, also go to countries like Tanzania and Laos and Ecuador and etc. But what you see here is that potentially in the future, because of the technology and the research and the science behind it, that there's an enormous group of countries in this world that will be left behind. See, so here, I think in terms of agenda, it's one thing to respond to the pandemic and say, we need a new governance structure to address future pandemics. We need a treaty. Maybe we need something like the Financial Stability Board that emerged after the crisis in 2008, 2009 of the G20 that can set regulations that the world will actually follow. Maybe something like an overall global health board under which all these other international health organizations will be, like Gavi and WHO, UNICEF, etc. But that's to some extent, a short-term response, even if it gets encoded into a treaty. But the longer issue for the science world and the research is, how do you ensure that all countries in this world become part of it, and that the investments in science and research, including for future pandemics, also happens in the countries like Rwanda and Zambia and Bangladesh and Indonesia and Peru and Colombia. See, so that's an issue that I think when you talk about science diplomacy is an agenda that needs to be taken serious. Almost, if you like, from the if you talk about the pandemic, maybe a similar thing as the IPCC, which had a huge kind of recognition ultimately, and on which the treaty ultimately was built. If you can kind of build the science and technology in the health and medical sciences across also strengthening the capacity and in the poorer countries, I think ultimately all of us will be the richer for it.
Thank you. Annelies, I'm going to let you come back. I'm going to give everybody one more chance to speak, but I'm seeing that we're running low on time. So what I want to do is ask that our poll results get shown so everybody can see what came up with that. So we can see here, and maybe this is because we're in an alliances roundtable, that alliances with establishing alliances with multiple stakeholder types came out on top, which is interesting here. But what we can see, well, that one seems to be very much the top one. Oh, and then we get down to the bottom here. Sorry, if I scroll down, balancing scientific evidence and other political interests and addressing my country first bias and positions and biases come out as our top vote getters. And this corresponds with the survey we did before, which is that very much the politicization of COVID is what people see across the board as kind of the key challenge. So I'm going to give you each a chance to speak. You can respond to each other. I also see several questions here, and I think they correspond to one of you. So let me read the questions as well that are coming from the audience. Roger, I think particularly for you, there's one that says, why is it that Anglo-Saxon and North American advice mechanisms seem more personalized, chief scientific advisors, while other countries have more institutionalized forms of advice, or is this a misconception? And then there's a second question here that's high up on the list, and maybe Annelies, you can consider this. What's the panelist opinion of the halt in some countries of the AstraZeneca vaccine, while the European medicine agencies keep saying that it's safe based on scientific data? And then there's one other question here, and maybe Oak, this one ties into some of the things that you've been talking about, how to make multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization fit to cope with the systemic challenges of the 21st century. How can science help with institutional reform processes? Imagine we could design the UN system from scratch. How should it look? In 30 seconds, you have to answer that. No, you have a few more than 30 seconds, but please let's take Annelies, if you want to start this round first. I'll turn over to you.
All right, I'll start with the AstraZeneca question. So AstraZeneca is the core for COVAX. It is worldwide the most manufactured vaccine. We have the highest number of big volumes for AstraZeneca at a relatively it's very cost effective. It's easy to give. It doesn't need the sub-zero freezers. And it's reasonably effective. So with an effectiveness of at least 70%. And we've seen after the phase 3 trials when it was rolled out in Scotland and the rest of the UK, how effective it was. It was identical to the Pfizer vaccine in terms of effectiveness, in terms of reducing hospitalizations, deaths, and severe disease. So AstraZeneca we really depend on the AstraZeneca vaccine. Without it, COVAX at the current moment would fall apart. The next vaccine similar to AstraZeneca is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that we just issued it. In fact, today, that's why I was late. I had a conference, the press conference. And Johnson will only give the vaccines to COVAX in September because the US bought all the vaccines beforehand. So the US will get 100 million in next month, and then they have to supply and manufacture. And then from September onwards, COVAX will get it. So we are very dependent on AstraZeneca. Clearly in a moment, but clearly the benefit to risk assessment is in the favor of using this vaccine. There may be a concern, there may indeed be a safety signal, but we have to keep in mind, if you have 30 adverse events out of 70 million doses given, that would then reduce deaths and hospitalization and protect healthcare systems. Clearly the benefit is towards the use of AstraZeneca. In the future, when you have more vaccines, we can and available accessible to everyone, maybe we can then start saying, okay, for this situation, this vaccine is better for this, and way of the trade, there are trade-offs. But for the current moment, AstraZeneca is very important to the world.
Great, thank you. Roger, please. Last comment.
Yeah, I'll respond to Tim Fink on that question separately. I'm gonna use 1 minute to highlight what we haven't talked about, which I think is an absolutely essential issue in the governance of research going forward. As the pandemic winds down in the coming year, there's going to be an explosion of research and research funding on what is called PPPs, potential pandemic pathogens. And there's going to be a lot more work done around the world in laboratories handling different pathogens that could lead to a pandemic. It's going to be absolutely essential for the world as this research goes forward to reopen debates that occurred about a decade ago about how best to manage the risks associated with doing this research. The idea of lab escapes of dangerous pathogens is not hypothetical. It's happened before. The most recent case of smallpox in a human was due to a lab escape. So at the same time, science and technology have the answers to pandemics, but in doing that research, there's also risks. And as Oak said at the very opening, we should look at pandemic research very much like we look at nuclear weapon research. It's important, it's essential, but it also is something that we need to stay on top of. Sometimes that might result in some hard lessons and some regulations that scientists don't like. So I'm going to put that out there as a topic that once the pandemic's over, our science advisory challenges are only going to get greater. And thanks to everyone, and Oak and Annelies, great to see you. and learn from you today.
Thanks, Roger. Oak, please, you have the final word
here. There's only 1 minute left, essentially. So let me just, in response to what's necessary for the future, apart from what we have discussed already, I think and also in response to overcoming this narrow-minded position of my country first. I think the world has a lot of space to ensure that two network systems of science and research work much closer together at a global scale, despite politics. And that's one, the collaboration of all the different national academies of sciences and engineering and medicine around the world. You have very strong in the UK, in Sweden, in Switzerland, in Germany, you have the Max Planck systems, and you have in China and India and South Africa and Brazil and Mexico and everywhere, Canada, United States, you have all these wonderful, very neutral but deep scientific objective organizations called the Royal Societies of Science or Medicine or Engineering or whatever their name is. The collaboration among those is weak, and especially weak in middle income and lower income countries. So both the Francophone and the Anglophone countries in Africa, but also in Latin America and in Asia, you can do a lot there. Singapore can play a major role, for example, in that field. In the same way, the various universities around the world closely working together is a major challenge. Way too many universities and academics are inward looking. They work, sure, they do some publications with their immediate colleagues in Boston or wherever it may be, but there is enormous space to go towards deeper collaboration among universities. And there are programs that do that called, for example, the Africa and Asia Centers of Excellence. And so there's an area there where there's enormous space to collaborate and almost overcome the political resistance to engage with these institutions. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me just wrap things up here. Let me first of all ask our graphic artist. We have someone who's been drawing the notes of this session. So if you would please share that with us so everyone can see this. This is really very interesting. It captures, I see, quite a lot of this extremely rich discussion, and this will be available to everyone to see and look over in more detail.
Very nice.
But let me just say again, thank you to Roger, Oak, Annelies for a really fascinating, rich discussion, and I hope we can continue it sometime. So it's been a pleasure meeting you all and having you with us. So thank you, and to everyone else, we have a short break, and then we come back with some afternoon sessions in half an hour.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.